We are live. I'm going to go ahead and do the opening, and then we'll start talking. I'm excited. All right. Hey, folks. Welcome to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel, we have Steve Edwards.
I'm going to sub in for AJ and say, yo, 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 coming at you from a sunny and blue Portland.
We also have Dan Shapir.
Hey, from a warm and sunny Tel Aviv. And here we lost Steve.
Right. Nice, sunny. There he goes. I'm
Charles
Max Wood from Top End Devs. A couple of quick things. One, I'm looking for work. So if you want to hire me to help you with podcasting or with programming, let me know. Chuck at topenddevs.com. And then I'm also launching JavaScript Geniuses this week. So go check that out at javascriptgeniuses.com. I usually hold that to the end, but anyway. We have a special guest this week, and that is Rich Harris. Rich, do you want to say hello?
Hello from Brooklyn, which is not sunny at all today. It is, in fact, quite gray out there.
Yeah. So, I think everybody knows you as the guy behind Svelte. I think that's the big thing. Are there any other things that people ought to know?
Up.
Roll up. Oh,
I was the original creator of Rollup, although I haven't been maintaining it for many years. It was taken over by Lucas, who has been a much better maintainer than I ever was, and it's really since then that it's become this sort of essential piece of the JavaScript ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's part of Vite, isn't it? Like Vite is kind of built on top of it.
Although
that's pretty amazing.
It just came out that Vite is starting to write their own tool for that based on Rust, so that they can sort of have complete control over that portion of their process. But yeah, till now it has been part of Vite.
Cool. So Dan invited you, and I don't know if he had something in particular that he wanted to go into first, or...
I'll start with a story because I know that's what you like, Chuck. And it's something it's something we spoke about a little bit before we started recording, which is about the first time that I actually met Rich in person. And that was at a conference called YGLF, or You Gotta Love Frontend, where Rich gave what turned out to be like a seminal talk. Kind of blew my mind at the time. And the name was Rethinking Reactivity, right? That's the name. And
That's right.
It was right when you introduced Svelte 3, which kind of turned everything on its head in a lot of ways. And now it seems that you're about to do it all over again with Svelte 5 and runes, and you tell us. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to kind of speak with you again and listen to what the new hotness is going to be.
Yeah, you could say that we're rethinking reactivity. We had a lot of really interesting ideas with Svelte 3. The idea was to see how far you can take a compiler-centric framework design and push that in order to have like this really idiomatic way of describing a reactive user interface. And a lot of it really succeeded. Like people, it turns out, love this style of authoring components. And we got it to power some really large and complex applications. And people have had a great time working on it. People have had a great time building stuff with it. But as the years have gone on, we've started to like butt up against the limits of what you can do with static analysis. And at the same time, there's been this renaissance of the idea of signal-based reactivity, really spearheaded by the Solid team, taking ideas that were like first being explored in the JavaScript world in like around 2009, 2010 maybe, with Knockout, and bringing that into the modern era. And nowadays, most frameworks are using signals to do their reactivity. Svelte was really one of the two odd people out. Svelte and React both doing things very differently to everyone else. And essentially, we decided to fall in line. We decided that signals are the right primitive to build a reactive framework on top of. but we have a slightly different relationship with them than other frameworks. And so I guess we can get into what I mean by that over the course of this podcast. But essentially, we are rewriting Svelte from the ground up. It's going to be the same authoring experience that people are familiar with to a very large extent, but it's going to get rid of the rough edges that people have found with the old static analysis based reactivity. And I'm pretty excited about the things that we're able to do now on top of this new foundation.
I think a good thing to do, just for folks that aren't as familiar, can you just give people like a really short explanation of what signals are? And then you can explain what Svelte is doing and why you're changing it.
Absolutely. So the idea of signals is that you have an object that represents some value that is changing over time. And then you have other parts of your code base that read those signals. And then you have a scheduler that is sort of aware of which functions are running and which functions are reading these reactive values. And so when those reactive values change, the scheduler is able to re-execute that code to, for example, keep a text node up to date with some piece of state that has changed in your application. And where signals differ from some other related primitives like observables is they're very effective at making sure that your code runs in a efficient and glitch-free manner. Like the code that relies on these reactive values doesn't overfire. It never fires prematurely. Everything just kind of flows in a very natural way down from your reactive state down to what we call the effects, which is the DOM updating in response to that state changing. And by building on top of signals, we're able to achieve this very surgical approach to updating the page. Instead of having to re-render things frequently or having to do a lot of checking to see if things are dirty or not, we can just sort of let the reactive graph do its thing and things naturally update in the optimal fashion.
So you mentioned Solid before, and of course, the guy who created Solid, Ryan Corniato, sometimes people refer to him as the CEO of Signals. And we had him as a guest several times on the podcast, and he likes to say about the Solid that Solid is effectively a state management framework which happens to update the user interface or the DOM. That it's almost like a side effect of what it is. Is your approach with Svelte or Svelte 5 kind of similar, or is it more you're just leveraging signals but still very much staying front-end framework?
So I think the outcome is essentially the same, but we are approaching it from very different directions. Ryan and I, we have almost opposing approaches to a lot of problems. Ryan is really incredible at thinking in terms of primitives and how those primitives fit together. And Solid is just this really elegant example of that. We have these primitives that represent these reactive concepts, and they tie together in a really beautiful way. Whereas on the Svelte team, we tend to sort of work backwards from what we want the authoring experience to be like. And so, we have this idea of what should go into a web framework, like what features are involved in creating a user interface. And from there, we work backwards to what do we need to implement for that to work. And they kind of meet in the middle. These two approaches meet in the middle, but we have these slightly different emphases. And it's actually, I think, really healthy to have two projects like these in the same sphere, because we can sort of bounce off each other a little bit and learn from each other a little bit, but also give people multiple options for how they want to build their applications based on their preferences. I think one interesting way in which we have sort of converged on that idea of it being a state management system with, DOM manipulation bolted on top is that previously Svelte was a component library, essentially. Kind of fills the same niche as React or Vue or something like that. But with Svelte 5, we're introducing this idea of universal reactivity. And so whereas previously you had this sort of magical reactive behavior inside your components, but then as soon as you needed to write code in JavaScript, you were sort of left out in the boring old black and white world of normal JavaScript. With Svelte 5, you can take your reactive constructs and you can bring them into your JavaScript modules and your TypeScript modules, so that we no longer have this nice, exciting reactive world inside components and then the world outside. It's all one thing. And we've done that by kind of bringing reactivity into the language itself, rather than by exposing these primitives for people to use.
So functionally then, if you're writing Svelte in Svelte 4 versus Svelte 5, how is it going to feel different? How is it going to look different?
So the most obvious example would be how you represent state in a component. In Svelte 3 and 4, somewhat famously, if you have a variable that needs to update and you want to have your component update in response to that changing, then you would just declare it using let or var. So you might have let count equals 0, and then inside a click handler, you might do count plus equals 1. So you click on a button that invokes that handler, and then wherever count is referenced inside your template, it will update. And that's still true, but now instead of that just being automatically reactive, you do let count equals $state parentheses 0. And what that is an instruction to the compiler. We call it a rune that is telling the compiler, oh, this piece of state right here, or this variable count is a reactive piece of state. It's going to be part of the reactive graph that you need to track. And when it updates, everything that depends on it is also going to need to update. So we've made things a little bit more explicit. And in return, you now have code that is super easy to refactor. It can be moved between components or outside of components. Multiple things can reference the same reactive primitives throughout your application. And it really gives you a lot of flexibility and power in how you define like which parts of your application are reactive and which parts are not.
So when you talk about state, I'm a primary view developer and haven't done a lot of Svelte. I'm thinking of, Vuex, or where you have a separate state. I think it's, what is it React uses for state management? I forget.
Relay or...
Yeah, Redux or something like that. Okay. So am I understanding that this is as simple as you to declare a variable with your rune inside a component? Is it automatically available in other components without having a separate library like a Redux or a Vuex to manage that, or how is that working?
Yeah, so you just use that inside a .svelte file, which is where you author your components. You can put it inside a .svelte.js file or a .svelte.ts file, and then you can just export that and use it in the context of other components. It's pretty unlikely that you would need a full-blown state management library because it's all just kind of built in, and you can pass these things around as component props, and you can pass them into functions and so on. And that idea of state management just kind of falls out naturally from the way that Svelte is designed. It's pretty unlikely that you're going to need to have a state management library on top of that. The one exception that I would maybe consider worthwhile is if you had some complicated logic that you wanted to model as a state machine. Like, we don't have a state machine primitive built into the framework, but it's really easy to build those sorts of abstractions on top of the runes that you get with the framework.
So how do you handle mutability issues then? So, it seems to me if you're declaring a state variable in one of your Svelte whatever files, right? And then you've got it available somewhere else. Maybe you mutate it in one place and it messes up something somewhere else. Whereas, I'm used to the Vuex pattern where you have state actions and where you commit your changes. I can't believe I'm blanking out on it. You can control where the mutability happens, where the actual changes happen, so you're not accidentally mutating something somewhere else. And it seems like if you just have a variable, okay, here it is, now it's available over here, you could actually mutate it in another place, and you're screwing up where you really don't want to affect your first template. Does that make sense?
So it's up to you how you expose the state that you create to other parts of your application. And there's a few ways that manifests. If you define some state inside a component and you pass it down to another component as a property, then if that component tries to mutate that state, we will actually say, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. And the way that we do that is we have this concept of ownership validation. So if one component, say component A, owns a piece of state and it passes it down to component B then tries to mutate it, it will say component B is trying to mutate some state that it does not own. That state was created in component A. And if you want component B to be able to mutate it, because actually it's very often quite useful, like if you're building something, you want to break it up into multiple components, then it's kind of useful if they can all share ownership of a piece of state. And the way that we do that in Svelte is with bindings. Instead of just passing a property down to a component, you can pass it down as a binding, and then that effectively gives the child component read-write access to the original piece of state.
So that's sort of like passing something by reference. You know, like in PHP, you talk about how you pass something where it's just, you can just see it versus you can actually mutate it, you know, when you're
in terms of mechanics, no, but in terms of like conceptually, yes, that's exactly what it is.
Okay.
You're literally passing ownership of the same piece of state, as opposed to giving someone else a read-only view of it. But
you have to specifically declare that possibility.
On both sides, yeah. So the component needs to say, this is something that I want to mutate. This needs to be a bindable property. And then the consuming component needs to actually invoke the binding with the, like, so where you pass in a prop, you do bind : count equals count instead of just count equals count.
So here's the thing about it, and I've encountered it in the context of Solid, where, you know, Solid is kind of deceptively similar to React in the way that it looks, because it uses JSX and the syntax looks very, very similar. But then you realize that the concept of components in Solid is much more diluted than it is in React, because in React, components are really self-contained, and you really need to be explicit about how you pass stuff into them or out of them. Whereas in Solid, you can share signals around, or you can put signals totally external to components. And therefore, components just kind of become a unit of code rather than necessarily a unit of rendering or of logic. Where does Svelte kind of stand in this regard?
If anything, we've taken that idea to its logical conclusion. So some years ago, I wrote a blog post called "Virtual DOM is Pure Overhead." And, this was
not
about
controversial at all.
You made people cry, I'm sure.
Yeah, so this was about trying to correct some misconceptions that people had about React's rendering model and whether it was, you know, faster than the real DOM or whatever. The details of that aren't so important. It was just that this X is the new overhead became sort of a baton that I could later be hit over the head with by Ryan, who wrote an article called "Components Are Pure Overhead," and so it's become this fun little meme. I think there's a quick blog post somewhere called "Hydration is Pure Overhead," and so on. And what Components of Pure Overhead was arguing was that, you know, a lot of frameworks, as you say, have this idea that a lot of the stuff lives in the component. In React, you don't call a function, you do like react.create component, and then you pass in the component constructor. And then when that component is rendered, there's all of this bookkeeping that happens so that like all of your hooks belong together and, you know, so on. Whereas in Solid, it's a lot more kind of transparent. Like a component can literally just return the result of calling document.create element. And that's totally legitimate in Solid. And that was, you know, a really smart blog post. And Svelte 5, I think, is probably the purest expression of that idea, because in Svelte 5, components are literally just function calls. If you have, you know, angle brackets, capital F foo to create a foo component inside another component, the compiler takes that and it turns it into a function call whose callee is just the foo function, and whose first argument is the anchor node that it should be prepended to, followed by an object of properties. And there is a little bit of bookkeeping that happens inside components. You know, we push onto a stack so that we can have a context API, for example. And for some lifecycle purposes, we keep track of when effects are running so that we can control the timing of effects, because we think it's very important that things run in a certain predictable fashion. But there's almost no work happening when you create a component. And it was really Dominic Ganaway who opened my eyes to the power of this when he joined the team and had been working on an experimental framework of his own called Octane. Sort of showed that if that's what your components are, if they are literally just function calls, then tooling can take that and it can inline some of those function calls, and it can really be smart about minimizing the overhead that is involved in composing multiple components together. And so, you know, Ryan was right, and we have absolutely no shame about stealing the best ideas from other frameworks, and that is no exception.
So components are really just a method of organizing code rather than having any runtime consequences, what you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, or hardly any runtime consequence.
That is, yeah, that is sort of the North Star. Like there was the talk that you referenced earlier in this podcast, Rethinking Reactivity, had a slide in which I say frameworks are not a tool for organizing your code; they are a tool for organizing your mind. And
I like that.
I don't think Svelte prior to version 5 really lived up to that, but now I think we really are. Like how you author your components and how that manifests in terms of the code that gets actually executed in the browser, like they don't need to be the same thing. You can optimize things by treating them as something other than how you wrote them, if that makes sense.
So going back to the practicalities, you said that if I want to create a reactive value in Svelte 5, instead of just doing let counter equals 0, I do let counter equals $state 0. First of all, it's interesting that you put dollar at the front rather than at the end, like solid and quick. I actually approve. I like dollar in front because I think it makes it clearer. Right, you don't need
Well, it
to
just
read
makes sense.
the
You hit the
entire...
dollar key and then you see a drop down list of all of the runes that are available to you.
Yeah, there's that, obviously. Also, the fact that just when you read the code, it's up front. You don't need to read the entire word to realize that that it's not you know, just a regular function. And I'm guessing it even makes parsing simpler because you see dollar up front, and you know, you don't need to like, but you know, put it aside. My question is actually different. What happens if I have old Svelte code that just has let counter equals 0? Will my counter stop being reactive? Will I need to do a global search and replace across my entire code base? What happens?
This is an excellent question, and I'm very happy that you asked it. The answer is it will continue to work. We have spent a lot of time making sure that Svelte 5 is as backwards compatible as it possibly can be. In fact, the first thing that we did when we started working on this code base was we ported over the Svelte 4 test suite. And so as we've been building Svelte 5, we've been building it against that existing test suite. So essentially, there are two ways that you can write a Svelte component now. There's what we internally call legacy mode. I guess it would be nicer to call it classic mode or something like that, so that people don't feel like their code is now technical debt. And then there is runes mode. And you can opt into runes mode explicitly by setting a compiler flag, but really the way to do it is just start writing runes. If you have a rune in your component, then the compiler will opt you into runes mode, and then you'll get the new style of reactivity. But if you don't do that, if you have an existing component, or if you're using a library that was built for Svelte 3 and 4, then even though the mechanics under the hood, it's still signal based, it's using this modern ultra fast system, the authoring is exactly the same. And it's very important to us that people are able to migrate their applications incrementally. You can upgrade from Svelte 4 to 5. Everything should, in theory, keep working. And then as you have time, you know, new components will be runes mode, and you can gradually migrate your old components to runes mode to take advantage of some of the new features. But it's a very important question, and I'm very glad that you gave me the opportunity to answer it. This is something that we take very seriously.
So I now have a new role for components in Svelte. They're a unit of versioning of Svelte. Basically, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying if in my component I had let x equals 1 and let y equals 2, or both of them are reactive. But now if I do let x, change just the x, let x equals state $state 1 and leave the y as it is, x is still reactive, but y is no longer reactive.
That's right. You need to migrate the entire component to runes mode, otherwise things will stop working. We plan to offer some automated migration tools to make that a little bit easier for folks. Although at our current stage of development, that's not our top priority. But before we have a stable, then that will be something that we offer.
So who is the fantasy fan that named things runes? Was that you, or is that somebody else?
So I have one of these guys. This is the Meta Quest 3, and on there is a game called Ragnarok.
Oh yes,
and
is
Ragnarok
that the drumming one?
It is the drumming one. So
yes.
I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with games like Beat Saber and all of these other rhythm games where you have sort of things flying at you and you need to either bat them away or punch them away or like simulate playing some sort of musical instrument. The shtick of Ragnarok is that you are the drummer on a Viking ship, and you need to motivate your rowers to row faster to Valhalla by smashing the runes as they come past you, and you have these drums in front of you. It is so. I don't play a lot of video games. I don't. I wish I had enough time to, but I don't. I love this game so much. It is incredibly fun and a really good workout. And so one day, we're thinking about what can we call this concept? What is a good name for something that is sort of like, it's a magical symbol. You're adding you're invoking some magic within your code, and it's changing the nature of its surroundings. We want a word that is memorable, that a lot of people would associate with that sort of thing. Ideally, a single syllable, and that is what we settled on. And the idea very much came from this stupid game where you have to make your Viking rowers row faster.
Well, funny story. I mean, when I think of elf runes, I think of Lord of the Rings because they're mentioned quite a bit in there.
Dwarven runes.
Or runes, yeah. Anyway, I thought it was elf. Anyway,
the Elvins have an Elvish script.
Right.
It's
okay.
Dwarven runes and Elvish script.
Sorry, I failed in my LOTR terminology. But you talk about Ragnarok. A couple of years ago, my company were remote, and we had a get together in Arlington, Washington D.C. area. And for a fun activity, we went to a place that uses the MetaQuest headset. It was a whole VR experience. It was down in a basement. And we had a couple hours to play games. And I came out of there sweating like a pig and had a killer workout. But the first game we played for probably a half hour was Ragnarok. And so, that was just crazy, just trying to keep up. There's like 5 different levels, and the first level was, pretty straightforward. You get to level 5 and it's like, a drummer for a rock band. It's just some of the craziest rhythms that you have to try to keep up with. And you're on the ship and you're racing with each other. And the faster you go, the faster your ship goes as compared to the other people. And there are circles coming at you, and you have your actual, it looks like drumsticks in the video game. And you have to hit on the ones with the X or however they mark them to get the right rhythm. And so the more accurate you are, the better your score is and the faster your ship goes. But man, it's a workout. And it's really a ton of fun too. Tremendous. It's a lot of heavy rock type music. For sure.
I actually have a son who's a professional drummer, so maybe
he would probably do well. Yeah, he would do well at that. Me, not so much.
Does it play on the Oculus or the Oculus MetaQuest, whatever? Does it play it on the Quest 2? Because that's the one I have.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Okay.
Going back to Svelte.
This was directly relevant. You know that.
Yeah. So we spoke about one rune, which is $state. What are the other runes?
So there's the 3 runes that form the sort of holy trinity of reactivity, which is state, derivations, and effects. State creates what are sometimes called the sources. dollar derived is the second rune, which creates a value that is derived from state. So, you know, an obvious toy example would be you've got let count equals $state0, let doubled equals dollar derived, parentheses count times 2. And it's a little bit different to other frameworks. If they have a computer primitive, then typically you'll pass in a function that returns a value. You can do that with a rune called derived.by, but typically you'll just use derived by itself, and you pass in an expression, and that expression becomes reactive. And we do that to discourage people from writing side effects inside their derivations, which is, you know, bad news bears, but it's like a trap that people will fall into quite often. And it's also just like more concise and nicer to look at. And these derived values.
Nice to be a compiler.
Sorry?
It's nice being a compiler.
It is. It absolutely is. We say this a lot. Every time we're weighing up different designs, we're like, well, what can we do that everyone else can't, because we don't have the same constraints? And being a compiler,
that's not exactly true anymore. I mean, everybody's becoming a compiler these days. Even React.
It's true, but like a lot of frameworks are using compilers as kind of like an optimization step, but they're they're religious about not allowing the compiler to change the semantics of the code. Whereas we sort of take this view that changing the semantics of code is exactly what frameworks are for. Like, all frameworks are changing the semantics of code. You know, hooks don't behave like normal functions, like these sort of functions that remember what the value was the last time you called them. That's weird. Angular has these things called zones, where like if you do something inside a set timeout, like it will track the stuff that happens inside the set timeout. That's weird. That's changing the semantics. You know, Vue does a lot of stuff with property assignments because everything is a proxy. That is also kind of weird. And we just draw the line in a slightly different place. We say it's okay to change the semantics as long as we're doing it in a clearly understandable way that improves the authoring experience without sacrificing the user experience. And so, yeah, being a compiler, it gives us this broader design space. And it gives us a slightly different mentality when we're figuring out the best solutions to various problems. And so dollar derived is one example. It's just a nicer way of declaring derivations than exists in other reactive systems.
And the third one?
The third one is the effect rune, which basically just defines a piece of work that happens when some arbitrary dependencies change. A good example would be you have a canvas element and you want to draw something to that canvas. You can't really do that declaratively using markup, because that's not how canvas works. So that is a case where you would have to use the escape hatch of being able to write imperative code inside an effect. Anything that you reference inside the effect, if it's a reactive piece of state, then when that changes, the effect will rerun. So, you know, if inside that canvas effect you have canvas.fillStyle equals color, and then color is a piece of state that changes, or it's a property that's passed into the component and that changes, then that effect will rerun. But what you don't have to do is explicitly tell the system which things your effect depends on, because this is the beauty of signal-based reactivity. It will just figure that out for you. That's the whole purpose. And so
similarly with dollar derived, though, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you basically analyze the code inside that rune, identify which signals it depends on, and then automatically update it, execute it whenever any of these signals changes.
Yeah, so that this all happens when the application is running. And this is the big difference with Svelte 3 and 4. In Svelte 3 and 4, we would actually look at the code that you wrote. And if you had a reactive statement that contained a reference to something, for example, your canvas.fillStyle equals color, right? We would look at the code itself, and we would see that reference to a reactive piece of state, and the compiler would emit code that depended specifically on that piece of state. But that doesn't scale very well, because if you want to take some part of that code and refactor it out into a helper function, then you're sort of out of luck, because the compiler can no longer see it. And so the big difference with Svelte 5 is we're relying on the reactive dependency graph to figure that out at runtime. And that turns out to be a lot more scalable, a lot more efficient. Not quite as cool, honestly. Like, there's something a little bit fun about using static analysis for this stuff, but it turns out that there are enough cases where that model falls apart. The signal-based approach is the right one.
Interesting. So in a lot of ways, you're even though you're very much still a compiler based, you're actually much closer to JavaScript than you previously were in certain ways.
We are, yes. We are still taking this compiler-centric mindset, but I think we're using it in a slightly more responsible way than maybe we did in the past. But yes, we are.
I have to say that previously this was one of my hangups about Svelte. That I know that you put it in a Svelte file, which really highlights the fact that this is not just a regular JavaScript file or a TypeScript file. But in certain ways, I used to say that Svelte was deceptively like JavaScript in terms of syntax, but very different in terms of semantics, and that's a problem, and at least in my opinion. And I really like the fact that you're able now to kind of, to a great extent, eliminate this semantic disconnect that existed before.
Yeah, and it means that we don't have to have two separate approaches to reactivity. Previously, we had, let count equals 0 inside your component. But then if you wanted to have some piece of reactive state that was shared between components, you couldn't then do that. You had to use something that we called a store. Stores still exist in Svelte 5, but they are sort of de-emphasized, because now you can create reactive state anywhere in your application, and you can share it between components very easily. And so everything is just a lot more unified than it ever has been before.
But it still needs to be inside Svelte files. I mean, I can't just use one of them inside of a regular JavaScript file, because then the compiler wouldn't see it. Or am I misunderstanding?
Right. So because we are essentially changing the language, we are adding something to the language. We took the decision to only do that inside .svelte.js and .svelte.ts files. So you still have the entirety of, everything that works with JavaScript and TypeScript, like all of the tooling works as you would expect. And these are just normal modules, so you can import things, you can share things between them as you would with any other module. But the Svelte language extensions will only apply to those .svelte.js files. But it gives you a place to put that shareable logic.
So as opposed to previously, in the past, a .svelte file would always be a component file by definition. And now, per my understanding, it could be a utility file containing, just rune declarations or helper functions or stuff like that just need to undergo the compilation step in order to work with the runes.
Exactly, yeah.
That's really cool. I really like that.
Yeah, for a while, we considered just doing it for every file in your code base. But we decided that was a little bit irresponsible. Firstly, it's going to mean that the compiler has to look at a lot more files, and it means that in any cases of ambiguity, we're a little bit stuck. But it also means that we're sort of squatting on this rune namespace. And if other frameworks were to come along and say, hey, you know what, that's actually a pretty cool idea, we want to do some version of it ourselves, well, that would be really difficult. But, if in the future, say, Preact wants to do some version of this, then you could do .preact.js, and they could have their own runic namespace inside their own code. So it's mostly out of kind of trying to be a good citizen, but also some obvious practical considerations have led us down that path.
Are you thinking about maybe trying to standardize or even spec the rune signature so that different implementations might be interoperable?
We have not, because we're still in this kind of exploratory phase where we're figuring out what what needs to be a rune, and what is potentially just a function that you can import from the library. And I think it makes sense to start with a working implementation and then see what happens in the wild. See if it makes sense to collaborate with other frameworks on something that is a little bit more standards flavored. It's interesting that at the moment we're having this conversation the day after the Signals proposal was made public. So for the last several months, a cross-framework team has been working on designing a signal primitive that would exist in the language itself, and that was released yesterday. So it has a concept that's analogous to our dollar state, and it has a concept that's analogous to our dollar derived. And then on top of those two things, you can build effects and all of these other things. And the idea is that all of these different frameworks are doing their own signal implementations. Wouldn't it be great if there was interoperability between the frameworks? You know, if I had a library that was emitting some sort of signal, then it could be used in all of these frameworks. Mm-hmm. And B, potentially these frameworks could get rid of some of their own runtime code in favor of just using the platform. And so there's these two things. There's the mechanics of signals themselves and having that primitive in the language. And then there's the like, how do you reference them in your code? And what we're focusing on is like this idea that signals should be essentially a part of the language, not just a primitive that you interact with like any other object. It's a part of the language because reactivity is so fundamental to the task of describing a user interface that it deserves to be a language level concept. And so those two things I think are like separate but parallel conversations that are worth having.
So you keep saying like the language and the platform, right? And I think when I talk to people about Svelte, usually they're just kind of referring to it as a framework. Can you kind of explain the different concepts here?
Yeah, it's difficult because Svelte sort of spans a lot of different categories. You know, it's not a traditional UI library in the manner of what came before. It is a compiler, but it is also a language. It's a superset of HTML. And the compiler takes that language and it compiles it down to JavaScript. That JavaScript imports code from the Svelte runtime library. That's how it you know does its updating and its rendering and everything. And then on top of that, we have an application framework called SvelteKit. And the boundaries of all of these things are a little bit fuzzy. When I talk about the language, what I essentially mean is, you know, in the same way that you have things in the language like dynamic import looks like a function, but it's not a function. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it be great if there was something akin to that that described reactive values? And that's what we're trying to do with runes.
Okay. The other question I have is, it seems like a lot of this is focused around sort of developer ergonomics and, you know, good developer experience. And I guess you probably won't know completely the answer to this question, but when people are talking about web applications, they're also then talking about performance and, you know, how well it works and scales and things like that. You know, can I have, you know, 15 signals or 80 signals or 2 million signals? You know, how do the runes play into all of this as far as, you know, the capabilities of the application, but also, you know, how it's going to perform if I go and build out some application on it?
The performance, honestly, is breathtaking. There's a framework that's very widely recognized, the JS Framework Benchmark, which is a really good sanity check for how well your framework does. And it fluctuates a little bit as we add and remove things, but Svelte it's basically Svelte 5 is basically the fastest mainstream framework. There's like a couple of other like very small ones that are very, very focused on the sorts of tasks that this benchmark tests for. But, you know, Svelte 5, it looks like it's probably going to be a little faster than Solid, which is sort of the gold standard for this sort of thing.
Okay.
And, you know, part of the reason is that, sorry, go ahead.
No, no, go on. You were saying part of the reason for that. I'm really interested.
Well, again, because we're a compiler, we have luxuries that other frameworks don't. So, for example, in Solid, if you create a signal and a function that updates that signal, you're creating a pair of closures. And closures aren't expensive, but they're also not free. In Svelte, when you create a source signal, it's just a very simple object. And when you read that signal and when you write to that signal, you're using these get and set functions, which are shared by all of these sources. So that's just like one small example of how having the ability to transform your code allows us to use a slightly more efficient way of reading and writing state without any ergonomic compromises.
You know what this kind of reminds me of? I'm old enough to remember compilers for languages like C and C++.
Mhm.
And back in the day, we usually, for these compilers, we had the developer mode and the release mode, where in the developer mode, it optimized for compilation time, whereas in release mode or production mode, it optimized for execution time. So it would run the compiler much longer, but generate much more optimized code. And I'm starting to think that that might start being relevant for some of the stuff that you're doing, that maybe during development you might be willing to generate less optimal code but just compile as quickly as possible so that the development environment would be nice and friendly. But then in the release mode you could theoretically like do really significant compilation, maybe even looking across components and stuff like that.
It's 100% the case. So we already do a lot of developer time checks. So earlier I talked about the ownership validation. If B mutates state owned by A, then Svelte will yell at you. Well, we actually only do that in development because in production that's just overhead, which no one is really going to benefit from. And so there are certainly cases where we do the slightly slow but more helpful thing in development mode. But the kinds of things that you're talking about, like cross-component analysis, is very much where we want to take a lot of these ideas. We actually had some experimentation early on. Dominic did it had like a whole tranche of work that was looking at this exact thing, but it was difficult to keep up to date with the rest of the framework when it was all so very much in flux. But that is something that we're chomping at the bit to revisit once Svelte 5 goes stable. We think there's huge upside here.
Yeah, well, premature optimization is the root of all evil,
Certainly is.
So it's interesting, though. Again, I kind of mentioned it before, but so obviously you were probably I wouldn't say that you were necessarily the first framework to use a compiler. I wouldn't be surprised if that's Marco, because Marco is like first at everything, turns out. But you were certainly, I think, the first one to really promote it and popularize it. But now it seems like, as I said before, that all frameworks are kind of, to a lesser or greater degree, embracing compilers. Even React with React Forget is embracing compilers. So how do you see the different approaches in this context, or are all of the frameworks effectively converging on the same place?
It's a great question. There's definitely been a lot of convergence just in general in the space over the last few years. And what I think tends to happen is there's a sort of compression as everyone converges on the same ideas, followed by a period of innovation in which people sort of go off and, now that we've centralized on a core set of ideas, like how do we differentiate ourselves from one another? And I think we're probably entering into that period right now. When we start to see, what our different foundations allow us to do differently. And for us, the kinds of things that we're thinking about are, as everyone else is thinking about a server first mentality, like everyone is sort of retreating from client side JavaScript in general, we're thinking, well, a lot of people still want to build these richly interactive client side applications. And yes, it's very essential that you have really tight integration with a back end. like no one's disputing the importance of progressive enhancement and server-side rendering and all of these other things. But at the same time, are we forgetting that there is a place for local first thinking and for, you know, on-device computation thinking and all of these other things that some frameworks candidly are starting to deprioritize in a way that worries me a little bit.
So no Svelte server components in the near future?
We do not have a plan right now to make Svelte server components. So our RSCs are obviously like this fascinating, brilliant idea, and they've sort of shaken up how everyone thinks about a lot of things yet again, because, you know, this is what the React team does. They'll sort of sit quietly for 3 years and then just blow everyone's minds with some new radical innovation. But to my mind, there are the good parts of React server components and there are the bad parts of React server components. And like I think a lot of the proponents of RSCs would probably say that the good parts are different. But in my experience, just seeing people struggle with the concept, I would say the good parts of React server components are the ability to do asynchronous data loading. You know, the fact that you can have async components and that just sort of works is very cool. But the bad parts are the idea that you have these two separate things running in two separate environments, and the ways that you can combine them are subject to certain constraints, and like the things that you can use in one environment that you can't use in another environment is like super hard for a lot of people who don't do this day in, day out all the time to get their heads around. And so, you know, the kinds of things that we're thinking about are, can we have the benefits of this asynchronous data loading approach? Like, can we have a weight in components in a way that is really orchestratable and makes sense from the point of hydration throughout the application lifecycle, without any of those sort of authoring drawbacks and the confusion that arises from having these two worlds sort of interleaved like that. And you know, we have some ideas. But a lot of it is unfortunately going to have to wait until after we ship Svelte 5.0, because otherwise we'll never ship Svelte 5.0.
So for Svelte 5.0, no innovations associated with hydration.
So our approach to hydration is pretty efficient. It's certainly faster than it was in Svelte 4, because we have decided that it's acceptable to assume that the structure of your application on the client side is the same as it was on the server side. Like, you're rendering the same components. And so as soon as you have that constraint as part of your model, you can make your hydration a lot faster than if you try to like gracefully repair every piece of slightly malformed DOM that you encounter. So right out of the gate, hydration is really fast in Svelte 5. Because we're a compiler, we're able to do things that might be a little bit trickier if you're using, say, JSX. We can do, you know, if you have, I don't know, an if browser block, and then you have some code in there, and then in the else bit, you have some other code. A lot of hydration algorithms will choke on that. They'll be like, hey, we've got a mismatch here. We might need to throw away some work and start again. Well, Svelte handles that just fine, because the compiler can just drop in a little annotation that the runtime then knows how to deal with. So I wouldn't say there are huge innovations around hydration, but it's fast and it's reliable and it's flexible. It's robust to things changing between the server render and the client render.
Yeah, but you're not trying to avoid, let's say, sending down certain code. You're basically just saying, my code is smaller because it's generated by a compiler, but I'm going to download the code for components because they might be re-rendered on the client.
Yeah, because it's a waste of time, honestly. I know a lot of focus is paid to the cost of hydrating an application, and that is not where the problem is. That is not why the performance of websites is sometimes not great. I mean, it might be if you have like a really slow framework that is slow to hydrate, but generally speaking, the problems lie elsewhere. And so I know that there are some frameworks whose whole deal is avoiding hydration cost.
Quick.
But
I was going to say, you should talk to Mishko, because he tells a little bit different story.
Yeah, I mean, of course he does, because that's that's why that framework exists.
Yeah.
But every time we profile Svelte sites that we see in the wild, the problems are things like, well, they disabled SSR, so they have a waterfall, and they disabled SSR because of some business requirement, or it's because they've got big images and we didn't do a good enough job of providing them with the tools to make sure that their images are tightly optimized. It's pretty rare that hydration moves the needle in our experience. And so our position is make it as fast as possible. If there are opportunities to skip hydration, in some cases, then take them. And there are some places where we do that in Svelte 5. Like if we have a big blob of HTML from a markdown post or something like that, just assume that it was the same between server and client render. But by and large, don't worry about it. It's not where the problems lie.
You were also, as I recall, one of the first frameworks, if not the first, to introduce the concept of progressive enhancement as related to hydration, or am I mistaken?
So we've been on the progressive enhancement bandwagon for some time now. I think the first release of SvelteKit's predecessor, Sapper, was in 2017, end of 2017, and we launched with server-side rendering. But I wouldn't say that we were the first people to do that. We were essentially copying Next and Nuxt, and even they were copying other prior art.
Remix was maybe one of the first.
No, Remix was actually pretty late to the game.
Oh yeah, because it was a big thing with Remix, as I recall. Like their first demo, where they showed everything effectively running totally server side, without anybody noticing, or something along these lines. Maybe it's worthwhile to quickly explain. Like this is not the point of this podcast, but maybe it's worthwhile to really quickly explain what progressive enhancement means in this context.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that we're even talking slightly past each other by using it to mean different things. But essentially, the idea of progressive enhancement is, well, take the analogy of an escalator. When it's running, when the electricity's on, the escalator, you stand on it and it takes you to the top or takes you to the bottom. But if the electricity fails, or if there's a mechanical failure or something, it becomes a staircase and you can still use it.
Oh, I really like this analogy.
Yeah, so the escalator is progressively enhanced from a staircase. You can still use it, but it's just nicer if you have the things running as you're using them. And in the context of a website, what that means is that if you have a page that doesn't have JavaScript for whatever reason, maybe you're on the subway and the JavaScript failed to load before you lost connectivity, or maybe you're on a browser that doesn't support some new JavaScript feature that is being used by that website, or one of 100 possible reasons why someone might not be running JavaScript, that website should continue to work. And that means that links should still take you to their destination. It means that you should still be able to interact with form elements. It means that you should be able to submit a form and send data back to the server. And it's that latter part where Remix added some innovation. They really prioritized form submissions in a way that other frameworks had kind of said, this is a problem that is solvable in user land, whereas Remix said, no, we're going to make this like a core part of the framework's offering. And that was a very welcome change. Like other frameworks certainly sat up and took notice and started doing the same thing. But progressive enhancement more broadly, this idea that if you have a website, it should work without JavaScript, is something that I think frameworks have been prioritizing for many, many years at this point.
And there was one more thing I wanted to ask. Oh yeah, one of my last questions. A lot of frameworks, it seems to me, are kind of embracing, in certain ways, in very different ways, concept of RPC as a means of communicating between the front end and the back end. Now, this is more a meta framework question than a framework question. But basically, it means that you invoke code on the server side in a way that looks semantically like calling a function. Is that something that you're also looking at, or thinking about, or considering?
I have some real qualms about RPC as it's being implemented by frameworks today. I think there is a real value in at least having to switch between different files if you're crossing a network boundary. there are too many ways in which it can go wrong. If you have some code that accesses a database directly and you just put that inside some code that is running on the front end, then even though the compiler is going to get rid of it, there is a non-zero chance that you are going to have some sensitive information in a source map or something like that. And in general, any type safety that you get across a network boundary is fictional. And I don't think that these RPC systems give you as much type safety as they purport to.
Well,
So
all TypeScript type safety is effectively fictional because it never happens at runtime, and
right.
so in a lot of ways it's no different than whatever other type safety you get from TypeScript. But it's really funny because we actually had Sam Selikoff on one of the episodes talking exactly about the scenario you just described, because he's the one that did that presentation with a slide that became a meme about embedding
terrific presentation.
some SQL. Yes, it was embedding some SQL inline inside the React component, which was, yeah, a lot of people didn't like that.
Yeah, so a lot of people were on one of two sides of that screenshot. There were the people who were like, oh my God, this is a giant security hole, because they didn't understand that the SQL in that screenshot was being escaped by the library. And then there were all of these other people on the other side of the spectrum being, you idiots, it's being escaped. There's no problem here. But the reality is, yes, that code was being escaped, but it would be so easy for someone to write a SQL query that was not being escaped. And by creating these arbitrary mini endpoints throughout your application and just like exposing this massive surface area to to would-be evildoers, I think there is there are some security questions that arise from this way of thinking about things. And like, look, smart people are thinking about all of these things, and I don't expect that we're about to experience a security apocalypse of RPC causing like all manner of new attacks. But I do think that just at a conceptual level, as you're writing the code, it's much easier to understand what's happening if there is just a tiny bit of friction between what's happening in the client side and what's happening on the server side. And for me, like a file boundary is a good place to express that distinction. In the context of a Vite application, and SvelteKit applications are Vite applications, you can use something like Telefunc, which will allow you to do RPC by importing, quote unquote, a function from a server-side module. And in the client, that is essentially, an RPC interface, which allows you to call that function on the server. But it's not inside the same file that is running client side. And this is, maybe a matter of preference, and maybe I'm being overly paranoid about this sort of thing. But I think there's too much. Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they didn't think about whether or not they should. Everyone's trying to be the slickest and most convenient thing. And sometimes that's right. I mean, Svelte certainly tries to be slick and convenient in a lot of places, but sometimes friction exists for a reason, and we forget that at our peril.
So just a final question on my part, because you mentioned SvelteKit. Is SvelteKit staying the same in this release? I mean, SvelteKit that runs with Svelte 5 is effectively going to be essentially the same as SvelteKit that's running with Svelte 4, or are there some changes on that front as well?
It's going to be exactly the same at release, I believe. I don't think we're going to introduce any new things that use the new state primitives, for example, straight away, because everything is just going to continue to work. It should just be like a seamless upgrade. You can take your existing SvelteKit 2 app and upgrade Svelte 4 to Svelte 5. Everything's going to be fine. That said, once we do get Svelte 5 out the door, there are certain ways that we're going to be able to capitalize on it within SvelteKit. And longer term, I think we have some ideas of where we want to take SvelteKit that are going to be easier because Svelte 5 exists.
So do you Do you have a date? I know people are wondering.
Come on, Charles. Don't do me like that.
Oh, somebody was going to ask it. Okay. Let me ask a different way then. So I'm figuring you have the roadmap pretty clear. It sounds like you know what you're putting in, how this is going together. It looks like you've got a lot of this kind of, bolted in. Are you still bolting pieces in? Are you polishing? Where are you at in the life cycle of releasing something like this?
So in terms of the design of the framework, I think we're pretty much done. There might still be one or two little API design questions that need to be resolved, but it's at this point, it is mostly implementing the things that we've said we're going to implement and fixing bugs. I wouldn't say that we're on the glide path yet.
Okay.
But we are pretty close. I think we're going to have a release candidate in the not too distant future and a stable release not too long after that. I'm just very hesitant to commit to a specific date
totally
because
fair.
in the past, whenever I've done that, people have got mad at me.
Makes sense. It looks like from the comments on YouTube that some folks have been able to try out Svelte 5, right? So whatever state it's in, and been able to get you feedback. So let's say that I'm thinking, oh, I want to try it out, right? Whether I'm an experienced Svelte 4 developer, whether I'm just, I'm trying it out and I'm like, I may as well just try the cutting edge thing. Where do I go pick that up and how do I give you feedback?
So the beta is available on npm. You do npm install Svelte at next. You will get the most in development version, the most cutting edge stuff. If you have an existing SvelteKit app, you can do that, and hopefully things will continue to work. If you're creating a new application and you want to try it out, then when you create your SvelteKit application with npm create svelte, it will present you an option to try out Svelte 5.
Okay.
And if you accept that, then you'll be opted into the new stuff. If people have feedback, it is extremely welcome. Come to github.com/sveltejs/svelte, and there is an issue tracker there. And we are accepting issues and pull requests for Svelte 5. A lot of people have already contributed, and it's been super helpful. Really great to have like an enthusiastic community who will take this very unfinished product and actually start putting it through its paces. It's helped us find a lot of things that might have slipped under the radar otherwise. And if you want to be one of those people, then please come on by.
I have to say that I really admire how very brave you are in the scope of changes that you're making in this version. I mean, it's totally not a trivial thing to take a framework that's already at version 5 or approaching version 5 and literally turning it on its head in a lot of ways. It's a big gamble, and I really appreciate you for doing it.
Well, thank you. And, it's a testament to the Svelte community that this has been met with, by and large, a lot of excitement and enthusiasm and not too much grumbling and why did you have to change it? We have this really great community that I'm very appreciative of, and they've been super encouraging and helpful throughout this whole process.
Yeah, I guess one other thing that I'm just curious about, do you have some idea how large the community is out there using Svelte?
Let me see. I guess the best proxy I can give for that is let's see how many people are in our Discord server right now. If I go to svelte.dev/chat. So there's 8,845 members online in our Discord right now.
Nice.
And we have 65,104 members. So it is, next to React and Vue and Angular and these other things, we are a teeny tiny project, but that's not a small number of people.
No.
I'm not exactly sure, by the way. I mean, obviously React is the biggest, and it's effectively as big as all the other frameworks put together. But once you go beyond React, the order is not as trivial as you might expect from what I've seen. I've been kind of using the the Google Crux database as a reference. Now, obviously, it only shows a certain subset, effectively just certain sites that Google ranks, but it's better than nothing. And then I'll try to look up to see what the current situation is, but I'm not sure it's quite as linear as you might think. That's what I'm thinking.
Well, we're growing, but it's mostly upside as far as we're concerned.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and slide us into the wrap up of the show. Rich, you kind of talked about people giving you feedback, but if they want to follow you or see what you're working on or connect in some way, where do people find you on the internet?
For my sins, I still hang out on twitter.com /Rich_Harris.
You and Elon.
I guess that's where I do most of my opinionating. But most of my time, I guess, is spent on GitHub. So come to the Svelte organization on GitHub and join the threads there. And our Discord, of course, svelte.dev/chat.
Yeah, that seems like an awesome thing. I just joined the Discord because I love Discord. All right, well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Steve, do you want to start us off with the picks?
All right, so you want to get to the high point of the episode first. I get that. I get that.
Let's
so,
peak early.
Peak early, right. So didn't really have any other picks here other than the dad jokes of the week, which are the high point. Rich, I'm not sure if you're aware of this. But anyway, so recently I found this diet diary that I was keeping when I was losing weight. And it says, day 1, I removed all of the fattening food from the house. It was delicious. Side note, I found another diary I kept when I was first born. It said, day 1, still recovering from the move. And day 2, everybody talks to me like I'm an idiot. I borrowed that one from Stephen Wright. Continuing along with the food theme, a lot of French words have actually crept into the English language over the years. Hors d'oeuvres, for starters. Right. And then, I've never really had pets because I'm just not good with pets. For instance, once I had a fish that could break dance, but only for 20 seconds and only once. Those are my picks of the week.
All right. Dan, what are your picks?
Okay, so we saw this movie on Netflix, which I really enjoyed, which is called I Care a Lot. It's described as an American satirical black comedy thriller film. It's with Rosamund Pike and Peter Dinklage, and like I said, we really enjoyed it. It's kind of gritty, dark comedy, and it has a certain message. So yeah, I recommend that. And the other thing is we've kind of been clearing out our library at home. Like we've got our library got to the point where we had 3 or 4 rows of books. So we thought that we needed to make some space. And I've been looking through my collection of science fiction and fantasy books and trying to see which ones I like to keep and which one I toss away. And some of the ones that I've decided to keep, I'm kind of reviewing or rereading and thinking about also maybe recommending for our listeners. So an interesting series that I recall enjoying very, very much when I read them, so I'm now going to reread them and see if I still enjoy them, is a series of books by a woman author. Her name is Julian May. It's called Saga of Pliocene Exile. It's kind of a cross between science fiction and fantasy in the sense that everything is kind of described in a sciencey sort of a way, but the settings is actually more similar to a fantasy series. Now, I will make a certain caveat. In some reviews have stated that it has some transphobic views in it. So if you might find that triggering, maybe this is not for you. I'm not sure that's the case or not, because as I said, it's been a really long time since I've read it. So now I'll reread it again and see if that's indeed the case. Um, but so that would be a series of books that I'll recommend based on my recollection of it being just an excellent series of books that I enjoyed reading like a few decades ago. And those would be my picks for today.
Awesome. I'm going to jump in with some picks here, and I probably picked this board game in the past, but we were playing it, and my 8-year-old wanted to play games, and so we pulled out some of the board games. But she wanted to play an adult game, and so we were pulling
Chess.
out not the kiddie games, right? Right. And for those of you who haven't listened for a while or are new, I pick a board game every week. So this one is actually a card game, not a board game this week. It's Sushi Go Party. And it does have a little board, but it's just kind of for keeping track of your points. And you have the different sushi options, right? Or sometimes you have other things like a spoon or chopsticks or something. And so what you do is it's a drafting game. So you have the cards in your hand, you keep one, and you put it down face down, you pass to the left. And then you reveal your card, and then you pick from the hand that was just handed to you, and do it all over again until all of the cards are exhausted. And then you score, and the scoring is based on whatever the different sushi options are, right? So the nigiri are just straight up the points that they that are on their face. You've got like miso soup. Whoever has the most of those, I think, gets a certain number of points. Anyway, there are a whole bunch of different things, and you can trade them out, right? So there are different kinds of sushi that you can swap in, right? And then you score the desserts at the end, and whoever has the most points wins. Board Game Geek has a weight of 1.30. So, really simple game. She could pick it up and play it. She actually won the second game we played. But it's mostly on sheer luck because, she's not quite to the point where she can look at all of the options and put them together in the right way that works, right? But she happened to collect enough of the right cards to make it happen for her the second time, which is kind of nice. Because, then she can play it and win. So, that Sushi Go Party, I think it takes 20 minutes, half hour to play a round of it. So, and it'll play up to 8 people. So if you have a big group and you're wanting a game that'll play all those people, then sometimes that's the issue, and you can definitely do it with Sushi Go Party.
We play Settlers of Catan at home, and I've yet to win.
Oh, really? That makes me sad. We don't play Settlers anymore. We have it. I
think it's called Catan now. I think they dropped the Settlers off, by the way.
Could be. And they have a bunch of variants of that too, which are fun. So anyway, I'll put an Amazon affiliate link in there too. If you click it, I get kickback, but you can just buy it wherever. It's been around for quite a while, so it's not like a hot game that's hard to track down. But yeah, if I do it this way, then people can just click and buy it. So other picks. I've been connecting with people a lot on LinkedIn, which I'm really liking. So I'm going to pick that. Mostly what I've been doing is I've either been reaching out to people that I've worked with in the past or have some connection to. It's like, oh, I'd like to connect with them again. As I mentioned at the start of the show, I'm looking for work. And so, sometimes people will throw me a connection or something. They're like, hey, connect with this person because they may be able to help you. But for the most part, it's just been nice to connect with people while I'm trying to figure out my work situation. And then the other two things are going to be the things that I'm putting together. So I'm putting together JavaScript Geniuses and Ruby Geniuses. I think I mentioned it on the show before, but I've finally got kind of all the platforms put together and everything so you can sign up and do it. It's going to be a weekly call. We talk about JavaScript stuff. We may invite people like Rich or Dan or, whoever else that we've had on the show to come in and just chat with us about what they're working on, right? So maybe we'll hit Rich up when Svelte 5 comes out and he can talk to us about what's involved there, or, whatever, when people are available. And then, just kind of do some coaching, some career connecting. But it's kind of that weekly meetup vibe that you get. And so if you're into Ruby or Java or JavaScript, I have basically one for each. And then the other thing is I just barely set up on Spreaker. I set up the premium podcast. So, we do insert ads into the audio of the podcast. And so if you want the version without the ads, or if you are just, you just want to support the show at $9 a month, that really helps because, anyway, I'd like to eventually not have sponsors, but in the meantime, if you want to help us out, that'd be great. And you can just get that at javascriptjabber.com/premium. All right, Rich, what are your picks?
Well, after being reminded about it during this conversation, my pick has to be Ragnarok.
Nice.
Go get yourself a Quest 3, download Ragnarok. You're going to have a great time. So the reason that we have a Quest 3 is because I was able to convince my wife that if I spent $500 on one of these, I was much less likely to spend $3,500 plus tax on a Vision Pro. And so far that has held true. I've yet to yield to temptation.
Can't you get them for cheap now that everybody is trying to return them?
Maybe. Honestly, I haven't even tried one yet, and I'm scared to do so in case I am then compelled to drop all that money on something that I will end up probably not using very often. But you know what? I think people are sleeping on virtual reality generally. I think that it's obviously early and there's a lot of things that are yet to be figured out. But if I had more time to spend on hobby projects and I wasn't working every hour God's hands on Svelte, then, forget about all this AI nonsense. VR's where's it's going to be.
I have to mention this. So something like 15 years ago, I think, more or less, I gave a talk at a conference where I said that if in a decade from now we are still using the same old laptop form factor, I'd be extremely disappointed with humanity. And here we are, still waiting on VR.
We're so close. We're so close.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this was really, really interesting. And we do these episodes and then I'm always like, I want to go try it right now. So anyway, thanks for coming, Rich. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, folks, we're going to end it here. Till next time, Max out.
Adios.
Bye. All right, hang on for a second.